So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Dina Khoury.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, for inviting me to this lovely city. I would not have made the trip to Russia had I not been invited here to St. Petersburg and to Kazan in a couple of days. I want to begin by saying that what I'm going to be talking about is not the project that I just finished, which is looks at war as a form of governance in Iraq in the 1980s and 90s. The book is entitled Iraq in Wartime, Slaughtering Martyrdom and Remembrance. What I'm talking to you today about is this particular archive of the Ba'ath Party that was taken out of Iraq after the American conquest in 2003 and has generated a great deal of controversy. And as you will find out, I'm quite critical of the process itself, but I have used this archive, and a substantial portion of my book is based on these archives. So what I want to talk to you about today is the archive itself and the controversy surrounding the archive. And so I want to begin my talk today with the story of an archive, its creation, its journey, and the legal and political problems that continue to plague it to the present. I do so in the hope of raising a number of questions. First, the nature of empire in the post-Cold War era, and second, about the nature of an archive as a historical record and repository of memory, particularly national memory. The Iraq Memory Foundation Archive, now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, is an archive that could not have been created without the help of the United States government, whose policies were informed by a hegemonic project that employed two languages at the same time, one of humanitarianism and the other of security. The Iraq Memory Foundation, as we shall see, navigated between these two languages to secure its acquisition and continued custody of the archive. As a result, the acquisition, custody, and access to these archives is at the center of a controversy about the conduct of the United States in its occupation of Iraq, the privatization of the business of conducting war in the age of war on terror, and the limits of the liberal and universal humanitarian discourse on human rights that is embedded in the forceful removal of dictators and the destruction of national institutions. This brings me to the second point I want to raise, which has to do with the nature of the archive as a repository of memory. The struggle over the Iraq Memory Foundation archive has as much to do with two conflicting visions of an archive. One embedded in a universalist articulation of archive as a repository of human rights abuses that should be open to all researchers, and the other as an archive of repository of a national memory that should be placed within the context of a national history and gives primacy to access primarily to nationals. Undergirding these two visions of archive is also the question of ownership. Do private non-governmental organizations provide the best guardians of these archives, or should these belong to national states or national libraries? A number of you do not remember the Iraqi invasion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, I bet. But this was a major point of conflict within the Middle East, and also had a great deal to do with a new imperial project of the United States that was in many ways an extension of the policies that were born in the United States in 1990 in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In April of 2003, so today what I want to do is begin with telling the story of the archives itself and the legal problems governing it. In April of 2003, a month after the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, Kanaan Makiya, an Iraqi exiled intellectual and founder of the Iraq Memory Foundation, was led by an American soldier to a cache of documents in what used to be the headquarters of the regional command of the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party of Iraq, which was the only legal party in Iraq, very much like the one party. Iraq was governed like a one-party state. Now, That is to say, in 2003, the documents were located in the American-controlled Green Zone. Makkiya was an outspoken supporter of the invasion of Iraq, a close associate of Wolfowitz, and deeply convinced that the regime in Iraq can only be moved by force. He went into Iraq with the American forces in April of 2003. Makkiya, with the help of the Americans, took custody of these records, more than 3 million pieces of paper, and stored them in his family home in the Green Zone. His aim was to create a national memorial institution located in this Green Zone on the site of the Victory Arch. If you remember the poster for this, for the top, it's got two huge arches that were built by Saddam Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war to commemorate his so-called victory, the so-called victory of Iraq over Iraq in 1988. The institution, the Iraq Memory Foundation in Iraq, would become a repository to back the state and party documents, eyewitness accounts, literature and art, that record and provide testimony to witness atrocities and ensures national reconciliation to today. Those of you who are citizens of this country, I'm sure you're familiar with Memorial, the institution that was the society institution that was founded in Russia to collect documents of Stalinist oppression, basically. I think this was the idea that he had in mind. The Iraq Memory Foundation was granted custody of these archives as a private contractor registered in Washington, D.C. Paul Bremer, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was the ruler, was the only legitimate ruler of Iraq. It's an American, there was an American, the Americans ruled through the Coalition Provisional Authority between April 2003 and June 2004, viewed the Iraq Memory Foundation as one of many private contractors hired by the United States to manage its occupation of Iraq, to manage as well the privatization of Iraqi national assets, and to manage the creation of a post-Ba'ath security and military apparatus. The Iraq Memory Foundation, however, was a special kind of a private contractor. Its self-described mandate was to manage the cultural memory of the Iraqi nation by turning seized state and party documents, not hitherto classified as an archive, into an archive of memory. Thus, the logic it used in its acquisition of the documents in 2003 was that these documents were cultural artifacts, similar to the manuscript collections and museum pieces that had been pillaged during the first week of the occupation from Iraq, from the National Archive and the Iraqi National Museum. And Makkiya claimed that he rescued these archives from pillage and that these archives were cultural artifacts that he plans, that the Iraq Memory Foundation plans to preserve. From the beginning, however, the Iraq Memory Foundation's custody of these documents was problematic, not only for the Iraqi government that would come to power after 2005, but also for the American Coalition Provisional Authority. Two issues came out: how to create and manage an archive which was essential to the international as well as national legitimacy of the US project in Iraq, and who would have custody of these archives: private non-governmental organizations, the Iraqi state, or a partnership between the Iraqi state and private non-governmental organization. So the central issue that emerged between 2003 and 2005 was whether a private non-governmental organization with access to resources and funding from an occupying power and registered in the United States can have legal custody of a national archive of an occupied country. Although Makkiya soon registered the foundation as an Iraqi organization, its funding continued to be from the United States State Department and the Pentagon, and its main office remained in Washington, D.C. More problematic for the foundation public-private partnership organizations that would scan and process seized Iraqi documents for the purpose of recording atrocities of the regime, locating the disappeared, and presenting evidence in support to support an Iraqi tribunal that was being set up to try the people of the leaders of the previous Ba'athist regime for crimes against humanity. The documentation needed for such evidence was to come, according to the Pentagon, largely but not exclusively from more than 100 million documents seized by the United States when it occupied Iraq and airlifted to Qatar and scanned and analyzed for evidence of the American case of the existence of weapons of mass destruction and of the Ba'athist regime's support of terrorists, which were two reasons, justifications the United States gave for its invasion of Iraq. The US, however, was also looking for evidence of gross human rights violations by the Ba'athist regime to support its humanitarian argument for the invasion. As an occupying power engaged in an ambitious nation-building and chaotic state-building project, the Coalition Provisional Authority, together with the Pentagon, followed an incoherent policy towards these archives. On the one hand, they maintained the custody of the documents they had under the legal rubric of an occupying power seizing enemy documents, something that was done in World War II and as well as in World War I. On the other, they tried to invest the Iraqi government they were attempting to create with ultimate guardianship of documents of the Ba'ath regime. The Iraq Memory Foundation had to navigate this incoherent policy in order to preserve its custody of the Ba'ath documents and expand its role in the market of expertise which flooded Iraq after the invasion. Everybody was an expert in everything. So the expertise is quite shallow on reading and understanding these documents for both humanitarian and security ends. Thus, to maintain its custody of the documents, it used two arguments. One, that these documents were an archive and a cultural heritage, and the other, that these documents fell under the rubric of seized enemy documents that could be used for security purposes as well as to document human rights abuses. Problems between the Iraq Memory Foundation and the Coalition Provisional Authority soon emerged Makia asked the American military to turn over all documents it had confiscated to the Iraqi Memory Foundation with the aim of making this own non-governmental memorial organization the sole repository of all documents of the Ba'athist regime. He was in effect asking that the Iraq Memory Foundation, not the future Iraqi government, become the archive of national memory. His justification for such a transfer was that the Iraq Memory Foundation, as a private contractor, had the expertise and the capacity to mobilize and train a cadre of experts to read and classify these documents, not only for their cultural value, but also for purposes of finding evidence for weapons of mass destruction. He requested funds from the Pentagon to carry out the scanning of documents and proposed that the Coalition Provisional Authority and the Iraq Memory Foundation create a joint task force to systemize the scanning and classification of these documents. The Pentagon, however, as well as the Coalition Provisional Authority, had other ideas. The CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, issued an order in April of 2004 establishing another non-governmental organization remarkably similar to the Iraq Memory Foundation that would, in its own words, document, study, and present publicly the history of atrocities suffered under the previous regime. This organization, like many others created by fiat by the Coalition Provisional Authority, never materialized. What was proposed instead was the creation of a new national archive, different from the Iraqi National Library and Archive, which was founded by the British who occupied Iraq in 1922, and would house documents of the fallen regime. Bureau of Missing Persons and attached it to the newly created Ministry of Human Rights, and tasked it in collecting all documents of the previous regime that had fallen into Iraqi private hands. Because in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, there was absolute complete chaos. A large number of Iraqis, many of them former Baathists, went into government buildings, particularly the security building of the Ministry of Interior, the police offices, and other ministries, and took over documents. And so the documents, there are so many documents of the Iraqi state that are now in private hands. The result was utter confusion as to the provenance and management of the documents of the past regime. There were now 4 legally sanctioned bodies that were to deal with these documents. The Iraq Memory Foundation as a private contractor, the Iraqi National Archive, the Ministry of Human Rights, and of course the United States, which has the bulk of these documents, more than 100 million of them. To complicate matters further, Saad Iskandar, in Iraqi exile with a doctorate from Oxford and a former guerrilla fighter with a Kurdish opposition party, returned to Iraq in November 2003 and was given a post of the Director General of the Iraqi National Library and Archive, which is the original archive of Iraq. That archive had been the victim of systematic looting orchestrated in part by remnants of the Ba'ath regime in the early days of the occupation. It had lost some 60% of its documents, 25% of its books and manuscripts, and 95% of other, documents that were, scattered within the library. Iskandar gradually began and systematically began rebuilding the library and archive with funding from foreign governments and international non-governmental organizations. Despite such sources of funding, Iskandar viewed and the Iraqi government viewed these archives as the patrimony of the nation. They were national archives under the guardianship of the Iraqi government. Soon after he returned, Iskandar began asking that all documents of the Ba'ath regime, those seized by the US government, those in custody of the Iraq Memory Foundation, and those in private hands be returned to the National Library and Archives, since it was the historic repository of all archives until the American invasion. It is this space, this confusing space, that Makkiya had to navigate to retain custody of the documents and retain some sort of legitimacy to the claims of the Iraq Memory Foundation. In February 2004, the Iraq Memory Foundation received a $2 million contract from the Pentagon, presumably to scan, preserve, and catalog the Ba'ath Party documents. To attain such a contract, it gave up its argument that these were cultural artifacts, but argued that the documents should be viewed not as an archive of memory, but rather as documents, state documents that are essential for the information they yield on security issues that are pertinent to the US occupation. In August 2004, 2 months after the US dissolved the Coalition Provisional Authority and set up a transitional Iraqi government that was to govern Iraq until 2005, Makkiya approached the Prime Minister's office for reauthorization of the CPA permission to collect these documents of the former regime and house them in a memorial institution on the grounds of the Victory Arch. He was granted authorization, but to do so, he had to argue that these documents were not cultural artifacts, but rather state documents that are important for security reasons. In 2005, in the midst of the deteriorating security situation in Iraq, the rise of an organized insurgency, and the beginnings of sectarian violence, Makkiya approached the Pentagon to transfer all the documents, the 3.5 million documents, the nearly 3.5 million documents, to US soil for safekeeping. He made the appeal on the grounds that these documents would help the Pentagon in its counterinsurgency efforts. It would help them understand who the insurgents were and where their constituencies were in Iraq. The Pentagon agreed, and the records were airlifted to a naval facility in West Virginia, where government contractors scanned them to look for intelligence, and then passed the scanned copies to the originals and the originals to the Iraq Memory Foundation. While the Washington office of the Iraq Memory Foundation could keep the scanned records, it had to find a place to keep the originals. There are a huge amount of documents, I don't know how many boxes. It first approached Harvard, which had dealt with captured Soviet records, of course, in the hope of storing these archives in Harvard, and that Harvard would help fund the maintenance and the cataloging of these documents. Harvard, of course, balked because of the sensitivity of the material and the ambiguity of the legal provenance. Between 2005 and 2007, the Iraq Memory Foundation found itself cut from US government funds and unable to find a place to house the original documents. In Iraq, challenges to its special role as a site of Iraqi efforts at reconciliation, together with its claims of ownership of a piece of prime real estate, which is the Victory Arch, crucial for the Iraqi government to control, made sidelined its effort to become the sole representative of these efforts as a private organization at reconciliation and an archive of memory. Thus, when in 2008, the Iraq Memory Foundation made public a 5-year deal with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University to house the original, help digitize them, and provide the staff and funding to catalog the archive, it was viewed by McPhee as the only option available to keep the archive in the United States and maintain some sort of custody of the archive. From the beginning, however, it was very, very problematic. By what right would a private organization transfer state papers to another private organization, and these state papers were taken under occupation by an occupying power and airlifted to the United States. So both in terms of US national law, international law, and Iraqi national law, this was really problematic. And both Hoover and McPhee were quite aware of this problem. Before the transfer, McPhee secured letters of permission from the Iraqi Prime Minister's office and from particularly from the Deputy Prime Minister, to transfer these documents with the understanding that ultimate ownership of these documents lies with the Iraqi state, that the Iraq Memory Foundation and the Hoover have custody of these documents, but do not hold them. Eventually, these would be transferred back to Iraq. Nevertheless, an international controversy erupted as soon as the deal was made public. Saad Iskandar, the director, of course, of the Iraq National Library and Archive, campaigned vigorously in the United States and in in Europe against the transfer. By the end of 2008, the Association of American Archivists, the Association of Canadian Archivists, UNESCO, also objected to the Hoover. And they wrote to the Hoover Institution protesting the transfer. The Hoover was legitimizing, according to the archivists' associations, as well as to a large part of the academic community and various research organizations in the United States, particularly the Social Science Research Council, which is the premier granting institution and research council for the social sciences in the United States, that this constituted the pillage and theft of national cultural patrimony. The Iraq Memory Foundation seizure and transfer of these archives constituted an act of pillage, and it clearly violated, according to the archivists, the Hague Conventions and Protocols of 1907 and 1957, as well as Fourth Geneva Convention statutes on the protection and transfer of cultural property. The Iraq Memory Foundation responded by making public a letter it had obtained from the Deputy Prime Minister of Culture, which stated that the Iraqi government approved this transfer and that these documents were the ultimate property of the Iraqi government, and that the Iraq Memory Foundation and Hoover were only temporary custodians. And so there was quite a bit of, in these years, quite a bit of acrimonious going back and forth, or publicly on websites of the Social Science Research Council or archives, as well as the internet, over the custody of these archives. And a large part of this debate was not only about the archives, but also about the American occupation and project in Iraq, which was quite criticized within the United States, not only by the academic community, but large sectors of the US population. So it became a political flashpoint. in the discourse on the discussions of the occupation of Iraq. In the spring of 2010, an Iraqi delegation, which included Iskandar and a representative of the Ministry of Culture, which was now the Iraqi ministry negotiating for these archives, visited the Hoover. A tentative agreement was reached. The agreement asserted that the Ba'ath Party archive was the property of the Iraqi people, and that Hoover and the Iraq National Library and Archive would cooperate to preserve the archive. There was, however, a caveat to the return of the originals to Iraq. This would take place in the future, not known when the future that would be, but would only take place with the involvement of the State Department, and would be part of a wider deal of returning documents seized and retained by the Pentagon. The agreement, as you can tell, is about confusing the archive as a cultural artifact with state documents as security and intelligence material. It is also as well about the ambiguous line that defined ownership of archive during and after the invasion of Iraq. Notwithstanding the working fiction that these archives are the ultimate property of the Iraqi government, who actually negotiates and owns them? Private institutions like the Hoover or the Memory Foundation, or state institutions like the State Department and the Iraqi National Archive, Library and Archive. So I want to move now to the second part of this, my talk, which actually is trying to make an argument that the conflict about these archives and link them to the Imperial Project, U.S. Imperial Project. The story of the Iraqi Memory Archive cannot be understood through the relatively narrow prism of legal rights over captured documents, I think, during wartime, or the struggle only between private organizations and national ones. We need, I think, to situate the story in the context of the global distribution of power and the language of international governance in the post-Cold War era. In particular, we need to look at the military dominance of the United States, the transformation of the United Nations from a function of arbitration in international conflict to an instrument of US hegemony in the 1990s, and the rise of a language of human rights and humanitarianism to justify military and other interventions in sovereign states. And through it all, Iraq provided the space of experimentation of all three components of the emergent system. The first of all, the 12-year embargo imposed by the United Nations, continuous military strikes, and an ultimate invasion all serve to highlight the marriage of overwhelming military power and force and aggressive humanitarian language used by the United States and its allies. So the story of the Iraq Memory Foundation is part of this narrative of empire and begins really in 1990 with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the first Gulf War. In 1989, Karan Makia, the founder of the Iraq Memory Foundation, published a book about Ba'athist Iraq entitled Republic of Fear. In the wake of the preparation for the first Gulf War, the book sold some 190,000 copies, despite its highly academic nature. I don't know if any of you, I mean, the academics here will know that if you sell 2,000 books, you are in seventh heaven. And you can start arguing for a Pulitzer. There's no way an academic book can sell 190,000.
Except Simon Shah.
Of course, of course. But certainly not an academic book that tells a very depressing story about the totalitarian regime and that's very specific to Iraq. So it's 190,000 copies despite its very academic nature. It propelled its writer, a dissident Iraqi intellectual in exile, an architect by training who trained at the MIT, onto the US international and international stage. Makia argued that the Iraqi regime was totalitarian and brutal. His book was used by the policy establishment to argue for the necessity of the invasion and to highlight Saddam Hussein as a and to highlight the fact that Saddam Hussein as a dictator. And for those of you who remember the Gulf War, the Hitler analogy, the Stalin analogy, always came up. It focused on in 1991 and 92. Makia published two other books. The first, entitled The Monument, was a thoughtful, a flawed contemplation on the aesthetics of the Ba'ath regime. And it was about the Victory Arch, the monument that was on the poster. It focused on the monument erected to celebrate the victory of Iraq over Iran after 8 long years of war and more than 1 million deaths between Iraq and Iran. The monument, according to Makia, stood for the vulgar and literal aesthetic of a regime that was corrupt and brutal. The arches were bronze castings based on actually Saddam Hussein's arms, replicas of Saddam Hussein's arms blown several sizes over, and the hands were replicas of Saddam Hussein's hands. The literalism of the structure was further enhanced by the base, which was made of these thousands of helmets, if you remember, or you won't remember, helmets that were worn by Iranian soldiers who now are dead and were collected by the Iraqi army. The monumentality and vulgarity of the structure stood for the kind of brutal logics of the back, according to Makia. Makia's second book was an account of the violent uprising against the regime in the wake of the First Gulf War. Based on oral interviews and access to documents that had been captured by the Kurdish opposition parties who took over the northern, after the First Gulf War, there was this huge uprising, and the regime suppressed the uprising in the southern parts of the country, but the northern parts eventually escaped the control of the Iraqi government, the Ba'ath government in Baghdad. And they were controlled by Kurdish nationalist parties who, as soon as they took control of the areas, took all the archives, all the documents that were available in security offices, local security offices, in the Ba'ath party offices, in the areas that came under their control, and seized them in large part because they wanted to prove to the world that the Iraqi regime in between 1987 and 1988, 89, had conducted this policy of ethnic cleansing against the population of the Kurds under the guise of a counterinsurgency campaign. The Kurds were rebelling during the Iran-Iraq war, so the Iraqi government went in and destroyed thousands of villages, moved populations, shot populations, and buried them in mass graves. So the Kurdish parties were hoping that by seizing these documents, they can alert the international community to the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds, which they wanted classified as genocide, and bring in people from human rights organizations to look at these documents. So anyway, Makia wrote this book based partly on oral interviews, also partly on these documents, and it was a harrowing indictment of the kind of violent society that the Ba'ath had created. It won 2 prizes and was favorably reviewed. More importantly, it made Makia the ultimate witness to the violence of the regime, and he became a spokesman for humanitarian intervention. In 1992, in a well-publicized BBC program, as well as another program that was aired in Frontline, a U.S. public broadcasting corporation program, Makia took journalists through the Kurdish areas of the north that had remained outside Baghdad's control, pointed to the destroyed villages that had been eradicated by the Ba'athist regime, asked the human rights community to come and look for evidence of genocide and exhume mass graves. It is in this context that the first cache of documents was airlifted out of Iraq by the US government. In 1992-93, through Makia's intervention, some 2.5 million documents that had been seized by the Kurdish political parties from government security and party offices were given to the United States. These were scanned through congressional and State Department funding, made accessible to Human Rights Watch, which issued a report accusing the Iraqi government of genocide against the Kurds. The US government's interest was not particularly with the predicament of the Kurds. It had been quite willing to overlook the gassing of Kurds in an infamous incident in 1988 when Iraq was still an ally of the United States. Rather, its interest was tied to its continued effort at the United Nations to maintain the embargo on Iraq. The Human Rights Watch report only helped it make its case. In 1993, Makia established Iraq Documentation and Research Center. The core of its documents were the scanned copies of the 2.5 million documents that were lifted out of northern Iraq by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government gave digitized copies of these archives to Makia, who now hoped that his research center would be established at Harvard. Makia saw the documentation and research center as a repository of the memory of Iraq, made accessible to international community and eventually to Iraqis, the documents of the regime's repressive apparatus. He saw it as a version of the kind of centers, many of them non-governmental organizations, cropping up in the wake of the end of the authoritarian and dictatorial regimes in Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and as well, and Cambodia. By 2001, when the US war on terror was directed at Iraq, Makia had become the leading figure of the Iraqi opposition abroad that was funded by the United States. He, among others, were openly advocating the US invasion of Iraq, assuring the Bush administration that Iraqis were yearning for democracy and that they would welcome American intervention to dislodge the regime. By late 2002, Makia had become convinced that a memorial foundation should be set up in Iraq to serve as a model of transitional justice and reconciliation. He viewed his work as witness to human rights abuses, his role in collecting and documenting these abuses as giving him and his organization legitimate claims to taking on such a huge national project, regardless of the outcome of the occupation and the wishes of the post-invasion Iraqi government. So his project had a great deal to do with Iraq, but it was also a project that was framed in a universalistic language of human rights, a language in which international norms and principles trump the wishes of sovereign states and their populations. So the Iraq Memory Foundation archive now at the Hoover includes two collections. The collection of 2.5 million documents that were given by the Kurdish parties in 1992 through the Makia connection to the US government and provided the basis of Human Rights Watch reports, and the documents of the Ba'ath Party Regional Command taken by Makia in 2003 and airlifted to the United States in 2005. Of these two collections, only the latter one, that is the one that was taken out in 2005, the one that was taken by Makia in 2003 and airlifted in 2005, has generated controversy and questions of international legality under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, protocols and the Geneva Convention. Because the first collection was given by Kurdish political parties hoping for US and international intervention on humanitarian grounds, their provenance is not questioned by archivists, by the current Iraqi government or international law. The originals continue to be held now at the University of Colorado, which has become their repository. I do not know under what laws these are held there at this point. The University of Colorado website says that they are open to researchers outside of intelligence analysts and US government employees. I know of no uninterested scholarly researcher who has used them thus far. However, because they are used as documents to prove gross human rights violations and genocide, they have not generated controversy as much as the 2003 acquisition has. But as Bruce Montgomery has shown in a recent study of the legal provenance of these documents, that is to say the 2003 document, the acquisition has been controversial precisely because its legality is murky. It is not legal under the older laws of governing traditional warfare, where states can take over enemy documents for security purposes, but non-state organizations like the Iraq Memory Foundation have no right to these documents. But under the new laws of war, where war was privatized to private contractors, the Iraq Memory Foundation was not illegal under the new rules established under the conquest of Iraq in 2003. The Ba'ath Party documents were taken by a private non-governmental organization registered as a private contractor to the US occupying forces. As a private contractor, it was not governed either by international law, or international laws of war, nor by the Iraqi or US law. Like Blackwater and other military contractors and security contractors, it was able to operate in a gray area of legality that accompanied the US invasion. How the controversy controversy over access, custody, and eventual return of the documents is resolved will have as much to do with international law, frankly, as it will with the political relations of the US government and the Iraqi government, the ability of the Hoover and the Iraq Memory Foundation to continue negotiating endlessly over this, and the internal politics of Iraq. I want to conclude by speaking briefly to another aspect of the controversy over the Iraq Memory Foundation, that is the issue of ownership of archive. Who has the right to state papers and records, particularly in nations that have been governed by one-party dictatorships, or in situations where sectors of the population have been subjected to state policies of ethnic cleansing or genocide? Is it the post-dictatorship state, national institutions, or private non-governmental organizations? This is, I think, an issue that carries some resonance for Russia as it does for Iraq at the present. Defenders of the Iraq Memory Foundation compared its project with the opening up of the Stasi files in Germany. But the similarities are deceiving. The Stasi files are run by the current German state, which in effect is what used to be the West German state, and is part of the National German Archives. Nor can the Iraq Memory Foundation project be compared to the Memorial project of the Russian Federation, which is essentially a civil society project created in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. The close relationship between the creation of the archive and the US Imperial Humanitarian Project makes its situation quite different than civil society organizations created in Latin America, South Africa, and many other post-Soviet states. However, the Iraqi situation is also quite different from a number of these states. The current parties who rule Iraq were persecuted under the Ba'ath regime. They are anxious to bolster and reinforce two distinct and highly politicized memories of that regime. One that insists that the regime was sectarian and targeted a particular sect in Islam, the Shia population of Iraq for oppression. And the other wants to ensure that the genocidal policies of the regime that targeted ethnic Kurdish minority are not forgotten. And this memory of the Kurdish genocide has become central to the construction of Kurdish national identity at the present, and gives the current government in the north of Iraq, regional government of the northern Iraq, legitimacy. So that this is a very political archive, and it's a very political memory of archive. In both cases, the political elite want to read these archives to support a sectarian or a nationalist agendas at best, and could use the archive for purposes of exacting retribution rather than fostering reconciliation. To a large degree, this is a situation that Makriya, as well as the Hoover, is well aware of. And he has used this logic to persuade sectors of the Iraqi governing elite, as well as supporters, that these documents should stay in the United States and be open to researchers who can provide, like me and others, these documents, less ideological reading of the Ba'athist rule. The extent to which that argument will and can be used to keep legal custody of these documents continues to be contested by international archivists, as well by Saad Iskandar of the Iraq National Library and Archive, and his supporters within the Iraqi government. Iskandar continues to offer three arguments in support of the custody of the Iraq National Library and Archive of these documents. First, that they were illegally pillaged and fall under the Hague and Geneva Conventions of protection of cultural artifacts. We have seen how the Iraq Memory Foundation's acquisition of these documents falls in a gray area of legality because it operated as a private contractor. The second argument is that these archives should not be singled out as special documents of an exceptional period, but should be included as part of an archive that places the Ba'athist period within the context of Iraqi national history, and should be in the National Archives, which was established in 1922. This perspective is quite different than Makriya's, the Hoover, the US, and parts of the certain members of the Iraqi government. For them, the Ba'ath regime was an exceptional regime in its brutality and its rationality. Its documents need to be placed in a distinct place and run by non-governmental organizations that owe little allegiance to the state and are not subject to its pressures. It is only then that remembrance of atrocities can provide a true venue for reconciliation. The Iraqi government at present seems to be taking a middle position. It is seeking the return of the originals to Iraq, including all documents currently handled by the Pentagon. However, it is planning, at least for now, to create a special archive for the Ba'athist period that highlights the exceptional nature of the Ba'athist regime. So the story of the Iraq Memory Foundation Archive is much about the politics of the post-war empire as it is about the disintegration of the monopoly of national states on the production or control of national memories. What makes its story controversial is the clear way in which its attempt at dismantling the hegemonic memory of the Ba'ath is intimately intertwined with the humanitarian language of empire in the late 20th and early 21st century, as well as the privatization of state archives. Thank you.
Dina, we had history happening, as it were, as the question of the archive and its location was debated and laid back in the paper. And also, we had a connection between history and politics. You can see how archives is not those backwaters where Luddite historians gather dust, but are actual points of contention in the political struggle, in the construction of memory, formulation of legitimacy, all this. So what I suggest is mix questions and comments and open the floor to discuss this very interesting paper.
I reserve the right to ask a more conceptual question later on.
Absolutely.
Kevin,
If you could stand up so that we can have your voice.
Sure. I really enjoyed the paper. I just wanted to ask if you could expand briefly on the appearances of the outcomes of work with these documents in the public discourse, both within the United States. We had a few of those appearances in the paper, the Helsinki Watch reports on human rights violations in Kurdish or in Iraq against Kurds. But I was wondering if these documents have produced any specific outcomes with regard to achieving a public memory of the Ba'ath regime within Iraqi society. How has this memory been used and fashioned? In other words,
It's an interesting question because, Iraqis have no access to these documents.
yeah. So I was wondering.
So nobody is talking about them. What the Iraqi government is dealing with now, as well as the Iraqi population, because at this point in time, it's an issue of survival. Nobody's worrying about ordinary Iraqis have no access to them, and academics don't have access to these archives. There is a very strong component in opposition to what took place. There is a tremendous hostility to what Mahdi and the Iraqi Memory Foundation took upon themselves in Iraq, because they're outsiders. There's a huge debate in Iraq between outsiders and insiders. These are exiles that have been out of Iraq for 20, 30 years. They come in. Why, for example, choose the Victory Arches? Because he happened to write a book about it. And why does it become the center for memory, so recording this memory? When they began, and I have to be quite honest about this, when the Americans went into Iraq, for about, I think, a few months, there was an active interest among sectors of the Iraqi population of recording this. There was hopefulness that, in fact, it's an occupation, we don't like it, but there's hope in that. And so the Iraq Memory Foundation started this project of oral history, collecting these remembrances of people on the back. But even that was a very ideological project because it only focused on people who were in the political position to back. The archives themselves are not there. They're not open to the Iraqi people and to Iraqi academics. And there's quite a lot of hostility to the Iraqi Memory Foundation project itself. And the fact that they're not within Iraq, on Iraqi soil. But But there's also another issue that has emerged, is that the Ba'ath regime implicated a large number of Iraqis. Nobody has clean hands, so to speak, in Iraq.
The Stasi problem.
Yeah, and so, including the people who govern Iraq are implicated in a large, and this will, becomes very clear because I work with these guys, and I used some of the information in them without naming names, that the ruling elite, whether we're talking about the Kurdish nationalist parties or talking about the current ruling elites, are implicated in many ways in the violence that was part of the regime. If not as collaborators with the regime, but certainly generating violence, generalized sense of violence. So I suspect that sectors of the Iraqi regime don't want this archive back.
So,
And the other sectors wanted that to prove very specific narratives.
yeah, I was just going to say, it seems like it's in fact sort of more useful as a sort of a meta-memory debate than a memory debate
Yes.
for both sides.
Yes.
The U.S. because they have their specific conception of the security concerns related to it, and the Iraqis because they have there's more to be gained by a memory under erasure than one which actually reveals its secrets.
Yes, and the whole conception of memory as a venue for reconciliation is a very debatable conception. So that for a large number of Iraqis, this might not be the way to do it. You see what I mean? I don't know, they didn't carry out a plebiscite, but the project of memory as a venue for reconciliation is something that was created in the context, in the Iraqi context, within an imperial project. And also, there's no indication that memory itself as a venue for reconciliation is totally acceptable by a large portion of the Iraqi population, or an ideal way for reconciliation. And so that erasure, it might not be active erasure, but a postponement, so to speak.
If I can jump on this, because the story we heard about Iraq is that all the wisdom of the occupation of Germany was forgotten. And the successful occupation of Germany was done because the program of denazification was not carried out in the initial phases. So in the discourse, when people were commenting on Iraq and the failure and the sectarian violence and the problem of the occupation, so many commentators said that the problem was that the good policy of not eradicating the local people in control was not pursued. In fact, the United States of America and the Allies were uprooting every civil service segments that held the society together. Now, what you're saying contradicts this story, because you said what you're basically saying is that the second and the third tier of people involved in government were able to stay in the post-war Iraq, and therefore we can talk about a possible comparison about the postponement of the denazification in Germany and de-Baathification in Iraq. Is that?
No, I think it's a much more violent process. You have to remember with the denazification of Iraq, there was no insurgency, no civil sectarian war. And so in the first, I would say, year or two of the occupation, the transfer was not as radical.
Mm-hmm.
It is with the emergence of sectarian violence, with the civil war, and with the insurgency, that there is a gradual breaking up of the mid-level old bureaucrats and security apparatus. But what's interesting about all of this is that the people, and it's being broken up under the guise of de-Baathification and installing members of governing parties who are Shi'is, who belong either to the Shi'i sect, who had been former Baathists. I mean, people talk about the Ba'ath, but everybody was sort of like, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt, everybody was a Ba'athist, but nobody was a Ba'athist. They were all Baathists. But now the ideology is that it's a sectarian kind of organization of politics. And
nonetheless, they don't want to open these archives.
Precisely because of this, because the names of the extent to which the Ba'ath had penetrated society would become very clear. And so those people who claim rights of and to certain entitlements and sort of are introducing new notions of citizenship are the same people who had been Ba'athists. And these archives are not reconciled. They will not actually lead to some sort of conversation, but a reversal, and sort of the opposite of the same coin.
I just had can I have one more short question?
Yeah, and then we want to make sure that.
Okay, this is a totally, I still have a conceptual question coming, I can feel it. But this is just a question, a technical question. So I think it's probably a fairly unique case that you have the financial might of the Pentagon involved with archival processing. And I'm just wondering what the digital archive looks like at this point. Because I'm thinking that it's all top secret maybe, but there might be, like, in fact, a completely new form of historicization of government documentation which is taking place here under wraps, as it were. Is this like a huge, like, $60 million document searchable text collection?
It's an interesting question because within the social science research community, as well as the social science research companies, there's a huge debate. At the end of the Bush administration, we're talking the second Bush administration, they had about, I think, $50 million or $100 million extra in the budget of the Pentagon. So they proposed this something called the Minerva Project. The Minerva Project, do you remember? I don't know if you remember.
Wolfowitz must have come up with that name.
I have no clue.
It's a Straussian concept.
So the Minerva Project was, they needed to get rid of the $100 or $50 million or $100 million, I don't remember. And one of the projects was and so they said, we have all these documents that are digitized, that have been selectively cleared and made accessible to people through the National Defense University, through Colorado. We need people to sit down and catalog them, archive them, and we need experts to do this. And, a number of universities jumped at this opportunity, but most of the academic community balked, as well as the social science, because it reminded them particularly of the 1950s Cold War debate and involved the sort of the cooperation between social scientists in the Cold War project, particularly in Chile and Latin America. So the project, though, spent the money. Part of it, as far as I know, is now run by a PhD in philosophy who knows no Arabic, who has no expertise in one-party system states. In the Naval College in Monterey, part of it is at the University of Colorado, part of it is at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., which has made the archive public. But as you particularly say, have pointed out, the way they classify this archive has nothing to do with the internal logic of the Ba'ath classification, and it's very ideological. So if you want to know what Saddam Hussein, if you want to keep learning Iraqi history through Saddam Hussein as a dictator, through tribal politics, you go to and through certain policies toward the United States and other states, and as a repressive regime and totalitarian regime, you used 50 or 100,000 documents that are now available to researchers at National Defense University. So the classification is not particularly, so there's Saddam Hussein tapes that are used, they're great viewing at that. I haven't used them, I took a political stance on this. But there's Saddam Hussein tapes that make for good reading in books, but have problems. Now the Iraq Memory Foundation, when I started working on these archives in 2007, they were still not with the Hoover. I got access to them because I asked. I had not met Karan Lakia, I knew nobody in the Iraq Memory Foundation. I got them through to a British academic who worked on Iraq, who had sympathies to the Communist Party in Iraq, which was very powerful, and was very totally suppressed by the Ba'ath and actually eliminated. So he told the head of the law community, there's this scholar who wants to work on that. And she's kosher, she's okay, she can do this. And so I looked at these documents as they had been classified for Human Rights Watch, as they had been classified for the Iraq Memory Project's Memorial Project. And they also had very little to do with the internal logic of Ba'athist organizations in the Ba'ath Party. They were classified under communists, around national parties, around Shi'is, around Shi'i parties. So and this is not how the Ba'ath work.
Right.
So you see only very sort of exactly a narrative that the Iraq Memory Foundation wanted to see. What's happening now at the Hoover is that they're reworking this because they're not professional archivists and they're not ideological in the same way.
Other questions?
You said about the oral history project, which was started in the first months of the invasion. Could you tell more about this project? Was it finished shortly or it was continued?
Yes, it started actually, the oral history project started in the 1990s, before the Iraq Memory Foundation was founded, but when it was still the Iraq Research Documentation Project. And it started by interviewing Iraqi exiles and recording their memories of Iraq before the Ba'ath and Iraq after the Ba'ath and how they suffered around the Ba'ath. And actually, a lot of them are quite interesting. Many of them actors and intellectuals and architects, and mostly the people who left in the 70s, many of them communists, left in the 70s and early 80s. This is the beginning of the project. Once they went into Iraq, they spent between 2003 and 2005 doing these interviews, and they hired people to do this. I have friends who worked as cinematographers in the project. Some of them are powerful testimonies of persecution. They started with political prisoners under the Ba'ath, soldiers, widows of soldiers, because Iraq had lost close to 620,000 men in its war. So it became a larger story than the strictly ideological story that had covered that branch. But they had to stop the project for two reasons. First, for security concerns, because nobody wanted to work with the Iraq Memory Foundation. There were bombs, there were security concerns about people who were working. Very little, less people wanted to testify or to give their memories of the Iraq, for the sake of the Iraq Memory Foundation. So you see, because it's a project that's so tied with the US invasion, it's a problematic project, even for people who hated the Ba'ath, you see what I mean, and suffered underneath it. So they stopped going. As far as I know, the oral history project in Iraq has stopped. It still has, there is an Iraq Memory Foundation separate from its archives that are at the Hoover that continues to run and function, but it's a much smaller scale, and there's no logic behind it beyond, this guy wants to tell a story that's taken.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about it is that it's really the first organization that was founded with trilingual organization, Arabic, Kurdish, and English. And for Iraqis who were raised on the sort of very nationalistic Arab ideology, the fact that it insists that it should be Kurdish and Arabic at the same time is quite something.
I have a quick question, and I know that Kevin has a more conceptual question. You suggest by your talk that the U.S. task force that went to the Second War did not understand the importance of seizing the archives, because you said it was in in the days of the Second War, the archives were looted. People were very much interested in going to the archives, but for a very specific reason, burning them and removing evidences of being spies, of being cooperators. I guess this is always the case with all wars and revolution. Once the regime changes, here and there archives burning, right? And then we very well know why this is happening. But the story you tell seems to suggest that the U.S. government, the U.S. task force, the U.S. military command did not understand the importance of the archive. We know from the history of the Second World War, where the Red Army, the Soviet Army, occupies a town. It's not so much concerned with saving military or technological targets, but the one thing they seize immediately is the archive, whatever is there. You can see that as a clock working, and you can see the logic. Is that so? Were they not interested in the archive?
Not this particular archive, not
Okay.
the Ba'ath Party archive, because it's amazing really to how little the United States policymakers knew about Iraq when they went to Iraq. I mean, very little. They had no clue what they were getting themselves into. They were very good at getting the Ministry of Defense archives and the Internal Security and the Ministry of Interior archives.
So this is how they understood the
Yes,
regime.
and this is for them ultimately what they were looking for.
Okay.
Weapons of mass destruction, proof that there were terrorists, that Iraq supported terrorists, and thirdly, issues of human rights. The BRCC, the Ba'ath Party archives, they had no clue how effective it was in the 80s and 90s as a one-party system. And so it didn't interest them. In fact, the story goes that this soldier comes to Kanaan Makia, who was in the Green Zone, and said, come, look what's there. There are boxes and boxes and boxes of documents strewn all over, some of them wet. And of course, Kanaan Makia knows what this is. He says, I want to rescue them in part because some of them had already been taken out. And I don't know how it was in the Soviet Union, but this regional headquarters, which is actually the center headquarters of the Ba'ath Party, was an archive. I mean, the Ba'ath Party, like all one parties, was obsessed with archiving its history and creating its own history. So it was a comprehensive archive, and he knew this. And so they were not interested in that aspect of it. And if you look at the Ba'ath Party archive itself, which I worked with, it's primarily an archive of bureaucracy. And it was a bureaucracy of governance. That is as simple as that. It had nothing to do with security issues. I mean, it has internal security issues, but larger security issues or defense issues.
Comments? Questions?
Well, my question is, it sort of takes us a little bit, continuing the discussion we were having earlier, and it concerns, maybe it goes too far from the topic, because I'm not sure how much you are researching contemporary problems of memory in general in Iraq. Is that something?
Yes, a little bit, yes. Yes.
I'm just interested by this idea of, there's this famous remark by Renan about, nations. What is the exact?
Everyday plebiscite.
It's about forgetting many things as well.
Yes.
This is another one.
It's about remembering as much as forgetting.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
And about
We can be together,
Yeah.
not because we remember, but because we can forget many things.
Yeah, because we've all forgotten many things as well. So it's a question about the use of suppression of memory in contemporary Iraq. I was wondering if this dynamic with regard to the disinterest in the actual uncovering of what is held in the archive is part of more common structures of memory production and social discipline production in contemporary Iraq around shared silences. Is contemporary Iraq's memory regime one in which structures of social discipline are created by certain kinds of shared complicities and silences, which support the contemporary institutions and contemporary coalitions?
Yes, I would say so. In terms of various shapes, but it is actively also a politics of memory based on specific erasures, but also specific, rereading.
Deformation.
Yes, of certain memory. So, and this is ultimately the ideological provenance of the state. It is not a state ideology based on nationalism in any way, but on various memory discourses that are based in tremendous erasures that are being continuously contested. So issues, for example, of martyrdom are central to defining remembrance. And there's a whole system of entitlements based, it's bureaucratized in ways that are quite interesting, so that there is a continuous give and take between certain memories and certain definitions of citizenship, and certain certain erasures and certain exclusions of citizenship, the meaning of citizenship. So it's a process that takes place all the time. And I don't know if you're interested in specific ways it works, but what I find quite interesting is that the current regime that began this process early in the 90s with the disintegration of a nationalist narrative and the memories, manufactured memories of this nationalist narrative. And it was continuously in conversation with humanitarian discourse on that. So it shaped humanitarian discourse, which is supposed to be this universalistic discourse, in ways that were very specific to certain forms of memory production, particularly around issues of martyrdom and persecution in Iraq. And it works in Iran as well like that, but specifically in Iraq. And it's continuously being contested now. So this is a whole discourse on victimization that's based on illusions of certain memories. And everybody knows this, but you need to like to talk about them. There's this anthropologist, a French anthropologist who works now in the United States, called Didier Fassin, who talks a lot about the production of a kind of subjecthood, citizenship, that is based on this kind of persecution of the projection of the body of suffering as a definition of citizenship. And central to this is the issue of witnessing in memory. And so he keeps saying there should be another politics of life other than this one. But certainly in Iraq, this is the politics that takes place all the time. Who is persecuted, how you remember your persecution, how you relive it in certain ways that are obviously manufactured. But there is a way of, there's a sort of silence in between and a complicity about what has happened.
Well, I think on that note, I would like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Dina Khoury